Welcome everyone. Today we have another new episode, and this episode we're going to discuss about macroeconomics, the income expenditure model. The Keynesian view of macroeconomics was developed during the general depressions in 1930s, long before the ad as model was popularized. Keynesian economic was traditionally explained with a different approaches known as the income expenditure or Keynesian cross model. The Kianse cross model is still useful today because it provides a much more detailed and intuitive explanations of aggregate demand than is given in the ADS model. It provides a richer understanding of the components of aggregate expenditure, consumptions, investment, government spending, and net export. It teaches more about what cause recessionary and inflationary gap. It explains the expenditure multiplier. Aggregate expenditure function. Graphical relationship between national income as a function of aggregate expenditure, which is defined as consumption plus investment plus government spending plus net export. Aggregate expenditure schedule. Aggregate expenditure function expressed as a table. Income expenditure model. The fundamental assumptions of the Keynesian economics is that economic activity, that is output and employment, are determined preliminary by the amount of aggregate demand in the economy. The model makes no explicit mention of aggregate supply or of the price level. Remember that GDP can be though of in several equivalent ways, measurable both the value of spending on final goods, the value of production of final goods. Building the aggregate expenditure schedules. Aggregate expenditure C plus I plus G plus X minus M. A key part of the income expenditure model is understanding that as a national income rise, so does aggregate expenditure. Autonomous consumption, the amount consumer spend if the income was zero. Example, consumer expenditure which is caused by something other than income, for example borrowing. Consumption function, graphical relationship between national income and consumption expenditures. Algebraically, C equals to A plus MPC multiplied by Y, where A is autonomous consumptions, the amount of consumption expenditure with Y equals to 0. MPC is a marginal propensities to consumer and Y is national income. Marginal propensity to consumer. Fraction of any changes in income which is spent algebraically MPC equals to delta C divided by delta Y. Marginal propensity to save. Fraction of any charges in income which is saved. Algebraically MPS equals to delta S divided by delta Y. Aggregate expenditure consumption as a function of national income. In the expenditure outcome model, how does consumer consumption increase with the level of national income? Output of the horizontal axis is conceptually the same as national income since the value of all final output that is produced and sold must be income to someone. Somewhere is the keys is the economy. At a national income level of zero, $600 is consumed, then each time income rise by $1,000. Consumption rise by $800 because in this example the marginal propensity to consumption is 8.8. Aggregate expenditure, investment, government spending, and net export. Aggregate expenditure function. Graphical relationship between national income as a function of aggregate expenditure, which is defined as consumption plus investment plus government spending plus net export. Aggregate expenditure schedule. Aggregate expenditure function of expressed as a table. Autonomous expenditure. All the component of aggregate expenditure which do not vary with national income. These include autonomous consumption, investment, government, and export expenditures. Government spending function. Horizontal line shows the relationship between national income and the government spending. Investment expenditure function. Horizontal line shows the relationship between national income and the government expenditure. Marginal propensity to impact. Fraction of any change in income which is spent. Algebraically, MPI equals to delta M divided by delta Y. Net exports function. Graphical relationship between national income and net export. Investment as a function of national income. The investment function is drawn as horizontally line because investment is based on interest rates and expectations about the future, and it does not change while the level of current national income. In this example, investment expenditure are at level of 500 wherever changes in fraction like technological opportunity, expectation about near-term economic growth, and interest rate would all cause the investment function to shift up or down. The level of government spending is determined by political factor, not by the end level of real GDP in a given year. Thus, government spending is drawn as a horizontal line. In this example, government spending is at a level of 1,300. Congressional decisions to increase government spending will cause the horizontal line to shift up, with the decisions to reduce spending would cause it to shift down. Export and import as a function of national income. The export function is drawn as a horizontal line because exports are determined by the buying power of other countries and thus do not change with the size of the domestic economy. In this example, exports are set at 840. However, export can shift up or down depending on bulling pattern in other countries. The import function is drawn in negative territory because spending on important products are a subtraction from expenditure in the domestic economy. In this example, the marginal propensity to imports is zero point 0.1. So import are calculated by multiplying the level of income by zero point 0.1. The aggregate example expenditure function. Here is a real GDP is Y and aggregate expenditure is X. Aggregate expenditure function here is the model. Equilibriums in the income expenditure model. Consumption function. Graphical relationship between national income and consumption expenditure algebraically. C equals to A plus MPC, where A is autonomous consumptions, the amount of consumption expenditure when Y equals to 0. MPC is the marginal propensity to consumer and Y is national income. Income expenditure line. All combination of national income and aggregate expenditure where national income equals aggregate expenditure. Graphically, this is 45-degree like on the Kiances cross diagram. Where equilibrium function. Macroequilibrium occurs at the level of GDP where the aggregate expenditure line across 45-degree. It is only point on the aggregate expenditures line where total quality of goods and services being purchased equally the total quantity of goods and services being produced. The meaning of equilibrium remain the same. That is, equilibrium is point of balance where no incentive exists to shift away from the outcome. Finding equilibrium using algebra. In the income expenditure model, the equilibrium occurs at the level of GDP, where aggregate expenditure equal national income. Given algebraic equations for the aggregate expenditure line and the income equals to expenditure line, the point where they cross can be really calculated. Step 1. Determine the aggregate expenditure function. Step 2. The equation for the 45-degree line, the set of point where GDP or national income on the horizontal axis is equal to aggregate expenditure on the vertical axis. Thus, the equation for the 45-degree line AE equals to Y. The next step is to solve these two equations for Y. Substitute Y for AE. Insert the term 0.3 Y for the average tax rate is T. The produce on the equation with only one variable Y. Work through the algebra and solve for Y. Finding equilibrium using algebra. Image an economy defined by the following. C equals to 140 plus 0.9. This is consumption function where 140 is autonomous consumptions, 0.9 is the marginal propensity to consume, and YD is disposable. Y equals to Y is a national income, tax revenue 0.03. Note that 0.3 is the average income tax rate. Investment is equals to 400, government spending 800, export 600, import 0.15 Y. Determine the aggregate expenditure function using the number above. It is 140 plus 0.9 plus 400 plus 800 plus 600 minus 0.15 Y. Step 1. The equation for the 45-degree line in the set of point where GDP or national income of the horizontal axis is equal to aggregate expenditure on the vertical axis. Thus, the equation for 45-degree lines is AE equals to Y. The next step is to solve these two equations for Y. The while each other substitute Y equals to AE. So y equals to AE equals to 140 plus zero point 0.9 y minus t plus 400 plus 800 plus 600 plus minus 0.15 y. Step 4. Insert the terms 0.3 y for the tax rate t. This produces an equations with only one variable y. Step 4. Work through the algebra and solve for y. Y equals to 1940 plus 0.48 y, 0.52 y equals to 1940, y equals to 3730. Inflation gap. When macroequilibrium occurs at a level of GDP greater than potential GDP, thus unemployment is lower than the natural rate. Potential GDP line. Vertical line on the Kianse cross diagram indicating where GDP is at potential. Recession gap. When macroequilibrium occurs at a level of GDP less than potential GDP, thus employment is higher than the natural rate. The potential GDP line, a vertical line showing potential real GDP. GDP increase from to right to the gap. Potential GDP means the same line through the. It means in the ADAS diagram. If refers to the equations of outcome that the economy can produce with the full employment on its labor and physical capital. Recession and inflation gap. In the Kianse cross diagram, if the aggregate expenditure line interact the 45-degree line and the average of potential GDP, then the economy is in sound shape. The equilibrium might be level higher or lower. What might cause a recessionary gap? Anything that shifts the aggregate expenditure line down in potential cause of recession includes a declining in consumptions, a raise in advantage, a fall in investment, and the drop in government spending, or a rise in taxes, or a fall in expenditure, or a rise important. Real aggregate supply in the income expenditure model. The Kianse view of ADS model uses as an AS curve which is horizontal at the level of output below potential and vertical and the potential outcome. That the change in AD only affect GDP with below potential output but only affected the price level with an potential output. The spending multiple choice in the income expenditure. If you observe this graph, we can find in the x-axis is the real GDP and y-axis is the aggregate expenditures. So a spending multiplier equals to 1 divided by MPS. The power of multiplier effect is that an increase in expenditure has a large increase on the equilibrium outcome. The increase in expenditure is the vertical increase from AEO to AEI. However, the increase in equilibrium output shown on the horizontal axis is clearly large, thus spending multiply delta y divided by delta AE is greater than 1. So recall the macroequilibrium in the income expenditure model is found at the point where the level of GDP or the national income equal aggregate expenditure. The formula for the aggregate expenditure is aggregate expenditure equals to C plus 1 plus G plus X minus M. So here is the sum of the quick review, and quick review actually help us to understand different kind of economical aspects, and by this way we can grow our economical aspect in an effective way. Macroeconomics actually very important point, and macroeconomics actually help us to understand the GDP, understand the real gap, and understand the real efficient things. The quick review is that what are the component of aggregate expenditure and the importance in the income expenditure model. Explain and grow in the consumption function. What could cause the consumption function to grow steeper or flatter, or to shift up or down? What are the investment, government spending, and net expenditure function? How is the aggregate expenditure curve construction from the consumption, investment, government spending, and net export function? Explain macroequilibrium using the income expenditure model, identity macroequilibrium equilibrium graphical and using table. How do you find the macroequilibrium using algebra? More quick issue is that how do you define potential real GDP and be able to draw and expand the potential GDP line? Identify appropriate Kianse policies. Explain aggregate supply in the income expenditure model. Explain and demonstrate the multiplier graphically using income expenditure model. How do you determine how government spending should changes to reach equilibrium or full employment? This is ultimately the way of development, and this is ultimately the objective that how our economy can sustain. So in that situation, macroeconomics, we need to be very much careful and we need to be very much effective in that professional way. If you have any kind of question, you can communicate with me. Thank you everyone for joining today's session.